Okay, so Cindy Friedman, welcome to the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here.
Great. So you have recently published a paper that's called Human-Robot Relations, Human Interactants as Moral Patients of Their Own Agential Moral Actions Towards Robots. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but the paper itself is pretty clear and certainly very interesting. So let's explore the ideas in your paper. Now, the first thing we should probably do is to clarify some of the terminology. So in particular, you're focusing on so-called social robots. So first of all, what is a social robot, and could you perhaps give a few examples?
Right, so social robots are basically robots that can interact with us as humans in a sociable, human-like way. So they interact back with us. And specifically also, I look at humanoid social robots as well. So they don't only interact with us in a human-like way, but they also take on a human-like form. And I mean, there are a lot of examples of social robots that, take on a human-like form or take on a non-human-like form. So I think as far as humanoid robots go, probably a really well-known example is Sophia. So I don't know, maybe some listeners heard about her on the radio, on the news, or read about her on the internet. So she is a humanoid robot who was granted Saudi Arabian citizenship, interestingly enough. And then we also have some examples of non-humanoid social robots. For example, there's a robot called Paro, and this robot is a very cute little fluffy baby seal. And both these robots are social robots that we can interact with in a kind of human-like way.
Okay, so it's a robot that you can interact with and that somehow responds to you.
Yeah.
So that means that something like a Roomba vacuum cleaning robot would not be a social robot.
Yeah, exactly.
But it could look like a seal. It could look like a human. What matters is that they sort of interact with us in some special way. And just maybe also, so you use this term interactant, and do you just mean either the human or the robot, or what exactly do you mean by interactant?
I use the term human interactant because when I first started doing this kind of research and writing this paper, I used the term when I was referring to human beings, I was using the term user. So I'd say human users that are using these social robots, but it didn't feel quite right because we're more than just using this technology the way that we use a laptop or like a vacuum cleaner, for example, and other kind of pieces of technology. We interacting with them and they are interacting with us as well. So it was just kind of just to indicate that it's more than just using this kind of technology, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes, that's very clear. Thank you very much. Now, of course, you are not the only philosopher who has written about social robots. Maybe we can first talk just like about what the field looks like, so to speak. So what are some other issues that people have discussed in relation to the ethics of social robots?
Yeah, so I think there's been quite an explosion as far as research into social robotics are concerned. I think one of the most interesting questions that is being asked in relation to social robots and particularly humanoid social robots is looking at the question of rights, whether these robots deserve some kind of rights, and it's a very polarized debate. So some people ardently believe they should have rights, other people ardently believe they shouldn't. Some people are kind of in the middle somewhere for different reasons. There's also, moral questions surrounding what these robots should look like. Are there certain design specifications? Would it be morally okay to use them in some circumstances rather than other circumstances? And obviously, just generally looking at, the nature of our relations with them, how interacting with them, for example, may impact us individually as human beings, how we interact with other people in society as well. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, certainly a lot going on there. So, I mean, the first issue that you mentioned there, the issue about whether social robots should have some sort of rights or moral status, that really is, in a way, the question that you're discussing in this paper that we're talking about today. And when you are discussing that topic, you are using two more sort of technical terms. Namely, you talk about, on the one hand, moral agency, and on the other hand, moral patiency. And you also defend what you call an anthropocentric perspective. So maybe those three terms would also be terms that it would be good to explain before we sort of really get into the meat of the paper, so to speak, because those are key terms that we need to understand what you mean by them.
Sure. So moral agency itself, looking at defining moral agency in relation to social robotics and artificial intelligence itself, is quite a controversial topic. A lot of people, will say that these robots can have moral agency, or looking at different degrees of moral agency. So it's quite a complicated topic. But simply speaking, if we're thinking of moral agency in relation to my paper, it's really just a case of having the capacity to make moral decisions on our own, and being able to make these moral decisions by abiding to certain moral standards that we have in society. So, I mean, adult human beings, for example, are moral agents. We have the capacity to make moral decisions. That is the one side of the spectrum when we're looking at kind of moral social interaction.
That's the agency side.
Yeah, so that's the agency side. On the other side, you've got the moral patiency side. So as much as we have moral agents, we also have moral patients in society who then are impacted by the moral decisions that these moral agents are ultimately making. So Sven, for example, you are a moral agent, and you might make a moral decision or take a moral action towards me. And because I'm a moral patient, I will be morally impacted by that decision that you ultimately make. So that is kind of the difference between moral agency and moral patiency. As far as an anthropocentric perspective goes, that is really just a case of me defending my perspective, that I think it's really important when looking at ethics in relation to AI and robotics, that we always bear in mind how important it is to make sure that when designing this technology, implementing it, interacting with it, that we make sure that human beings are ultimately benefiting from this technology. Because what would be the point then of designing and creating this technology if it's not ultimately going to benefit human beings?
Okay, yeah. Just to be clear then, so when it comes to this distinction between moral agents and patients, so you had an example where I'm a moral agent and you're a moral patient, but presumably someone like you or someone like me, I hope, could both be a moral agent and a moral patient.
Yes.
Are there any cases where there would be something or someone who would be only a moral agent or maybe only a moral patient? Is it possible for those two to come apart?
They can come apart. I think, generally speaking, I think it's more widely accepted that if you are a moral agent, then you can also be a moral patient. Looking at it from the other perspective, if you are a moral patient, can you also be a moral agent? I mean, if you look at young children or even babies, for example, they are moral patients. They can suffer and be hurt, but they're not necessarily full moral agents yet. Animals as well can also suffer and feel pain. They are moral patients, but they aren't moral agents the way that human beings are moral agents. But I mean, it's quite interesting that you asked that question specifically in relation to robots and social robotics, because I think that kind of turns the general understanding of moral agents also being moral patients on its head. Because if we have different degrees of moral agency, we can think about the possibility of robots being some kind of moral agents, but also not having the capacity to be a moral patient. So it becomes a bit more of a complicated discussion, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also introduced a distinction between what you call actual moral patients and perceived moral patients. And we will get there. But let's work our way towards that idea via some other ideas first. One idea in particular that I would like to ask you to explain, which I found to be fascinating, was the idea that robots can be what you call conduits of human moral action towards human moral patience. So what exactly is this supposed to mean?
Right, so I decided to just focus a little bit more on moral patiency in relation to interaction between humans and robots. And basically, what you mentioned is a case of a human being using a robot to conduct a moral action towards another human being. So it would be a case of a human being maybe commanding a robot to injure a person. So if we think about, for example, the possibility of robotic warfare, maybe you have a military officer who is wanting to injure and kill an enemy combatant, for example, and then they will command a robot to do this as opposed to them having to actually go out onto the field and kill this human being. Or it could even be a case of, there's a lot of research going into looking at like using drones as well, possibly in warfare, and possibly also a military officer using a drone to shoot and kill a combatant as opposed to a person having to do this.
So rather than killing your enemy yourself, you send out a robot to do the dirty work, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay. Now there's a similar but not exactly identical idea that you also discuss, and that's the idea of humans as the moral patients of the actions of robots. And so how is that idea different from what we just talked about? And could you perhaps give an example or two?
So the difference is that with the first example, the robots wouldn't be autonomous decision makers. So they would basically be getting direct commands from a human being who would be operating kind of like through them. The second example, though, would be a case of looking at robots that have the capacity to make autonomous decisions by themselves. And I just think it's important to clarify that I'm not saying that these robots are moral agents. They don't have to be moral agents. They can be, but they don't have to be. And it may mean that they still are operating according to the programming that a human programmer has given them. But the thing is ultimately when push comes to shove in a split-second moment, for example, based on their programming, they may have to make a moral decision that may impact a human being. And I think a good example of this is thinking about autonomous cars, for example, self-driving cars. And for example, if I'm, sitting in my self-driving car and I'm driving along the highway and all of a sudden a pedestrian runs across the road, at that split second, that car has to make a decision. Are they going to carry on driving straight and kill the pedestrian and save me as a passenger? Or is the car going to swerve off the road and potentially injure me as a passenger, but save the pedestrian? So even though we could debate endlessly about whether this machine or this car specifically is a moral agent, it's still in that split moment, based on its programming, making a decision on its own, and either myself or the pedestrian that has crossed the road is a moral patient of that action that the car made.
Yeah, because you might be reading a newspaper or taking a nap or something like that, and you can't step in and take that decision for the car.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
fascinating. All right, let's now get then to this distinction between perceived moral patience and actual moral patience. Because you think that, and here comes another proposition that you discuss in your paper, you think that sometimes it can happen that human interactants are the moral patients of their own agential moral actions towards robots. Now, this is a little bit hard to understand, this idea, but it's a fascinating one once you get the hang of it. And one of the things that you sort of discuss in order to explain this is another distinction between perception and reality, namely between actual robot consciousness, if there is such a thing, and the perception of robot consciousness. So first of all, what is that, and how can we relate that back to this idea of our being the moral patients of our own actions towards robots?
Right, so actual robot consciousness would be a case of asking the question if robots can be conscious the same way in which human beings are conscious. And again, a very big, very controversial topic that is being debated endlessly, very polarized. And I think, we don't really have solid answers as to what human consciousness is. So it's difficult sometimes to think whether we could really know if robots could be truly conscious the way humans are if we don't really have clear answers as to what human consciousness is. So that would be actual robot consciousness if they really are conscious the way human beings are. But I circumnavigate this rather by looking at perceived robot consciousness, because my thought was that, okay, well, if the actual robot consciousness debate is so controversial, yet we have social humanoid robots who are human-like and interact with us in a human-like way, there is then the tendency for human beings to anthropomorphize them, which basically means that we're attributing human-like human-like attributions, attributes of them, and one of these attributes could be consciousness. And if it seems as if they are conscious, we perceive them as being conscious, and maybe then we might also perceive them as being moral patients, because if we treat them immorally, maybe this robot could act as if it's suffering or acts as if it's hurt or in pain, so we might perceive them as being moral patients. And I think
So the idea would then be that that they would behave in a certain way, the robot, and then some people just couldn't help themselves but think that the robot had some sort of consciousness, or at least emotionally react to it as if it had it.
Yes, exactly. And I think, there is definitely the potential that this may happen, because I think even just in everyday life as well, with maybe pieces of technology, or you even look at children who anthropomorphize their dolls, for example, and attribute these human-like characteristics to them, and they love them and they care for them, and they think that these toy dolls are really alive, for example. And I mean, obviously, it's children and they have these like amazing imaginations, but this happens with adults as well, with pieces of technology that we're interacting with that aren't even human-like. They don't even interact back with us. So if we have these human-like social robots that are interacting back with us, I think this even increases the chances of us forming these human-like bonds with them, caring for them, and attributing consciousness to them possibly.
And that would be the circumstance under which we could act in a way towards the robot that would appear to be immoral. And then you say that I mean, you actually defend the proposition that treating these social robots in an apparently immoral way does some sort of harm to the human interactants, the human who's interacting with those robots. And again, another fascinating idea. And so when you defend this idea, you sort of break it into three different parts, or you offer what you call three different sub-arguments. And so let's just go through those three sub-arguments. And so the first one has to do with, is a robot a mere tool or a mere object? And actually you argue or suggest that a social robot is more than a mere object. What do you mean by this?
Yeah, so I think we'd all agree that there's something to these social robots that make them seem that they're more than just regular and animate objects that we interact with on a daily basis. And even though they are just pieces of technology that we've designed and created, we're both sitting here on our computers now recording this with a laptop. It's a piece of technology. These robots are a piece of technology. But the difference is in the way that we interact with them. And like I said, they interact back with us. So we don't have to imagine, or I don't know, like imagine them in a certain way to kind of form bonds with them, because they make it possible for them to interact back with us. So these bonds seem kind of realistic. And they almost kind of sit in this middle ground, because they are robots, they are technology, so they're not humans the way we are human beings, but they also seem to be more than just you know, your normal Roomba vacuum cleaner, for example, or a laptop or a cell phone or something like that, and they kind of sit in the middle somewhere. So they just seem to be more than your inanimate technological devices.
And so the idea would then be that because they occupy this middle position between a tool and a I don't know, social being, it somehow is I don't know, bad taste or is something immoral in some way or other about treating them in an apparently immoral way. Uh, okay, now you also talk about a second sub-argument, and that sub-argument is that there can be something in itself abhorrent about treating a social robot in what appears to be an immoral way. Now, how could that be, and what do you mean by this idea?
So what I mean is that because these social robots are designed to look human, to interact with us in a human-like way, and also in some circumstances to occupy spaces in society that could otherwise be filled by human beings. So for example, if we think about sex robots or care robots or some kind of partner robots, for example, the reason for their design and creation is for them to possibly be substitutes for human beings. So it's kind of like they then are symbols of human beings because we as human interactants will interact with them as if they're human beings. So our interaction with them, because they are designed and created to be symbolic of human beings, our interaction then is also symbolic of interacting with a human being. And I guess, you know, intuitively, it just didn't feel right to me to then treat these social robots that are symbolic of human beings in an immoral way. Um, but I mean, we can't work with our intuition. It's not exactly a clear, rigorous academic argument. But
Right.
I think it's that symbolism that I
So
think is problematic.
intuitively, there seems to be something wrong with the symbolism of apparently mistreating a social robot that's supposed to
Yeah,
interact in a human-like way, or maybe like a pet, because
yeah.
we would think that it's wrong to mistreat a human and also a pet. Okay, so now this leads in a certain way to also to your third sub argument, where you say that treating as social robots immorally could also possibly negatively impact the moral fiber of the human interactant. And so what exactly do you mean by this?
By this, I mean, it kind of brings the first two sub-arguments together, and then I get to this third sub-argument where because these robots are more than just inanimate objects, because they are symbolic of human beings, we may then start to question and say, okay, hang on, if we are treating these robots immorally, would this negatively morally impact me and my moral fiber? Would it mean that my moral barriers are kind of lowered? Would it mean that I might start thinking that it's okay to treat people immorally? Would it mean that I might go out in society and it might change the way I interact with other people? Would I be more immoral towards other people? So yeah, that is I think the first two sub-arguments kind of lead to that third concern of mine.
Right. And then the overall conclusion is that somehow by apparently harming or hurting these social robots, we are ultimately potentially harming ourselves. Uh, so
Yes,
is that the
exactly.
conclusion? Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically the conclusion, and that basically brings us to the whole idea of the perceived moral patiency and the actual moral patiency. Because if I'm interacting with the social robot and I perceive it as being conscious and maybe perceive it as being a moral patient, I mean, sure, okay, that's fine, but they aren't actually being morally impacted by my immoral actions towards them. The one who is actually being impacted is me, because if I am treating them immorally and it damages my moral fiber, then I am the actual moral patient of these very immoral actions that I'm taking towards this social robot.
And that basically then takes us back to this idea of the anthropocentric perspective that you take, right?
Yes, it does, because it's basically saying that we shouldn't, I mean, not that it's not important, but at least in the context of my paper, I've tried to say that at least for now, maybe we shouldn't be so worried about whether robots can actually be moral patients and whether they deserve moral treatments themselves, but rather saying that we should treat these robots morally for our own human sake, to protect our own moral fiber. And that's where this anthropocentric perspective comes in, because I think it would be ultimately beneficial to us and our human morality to treat these robots morally well.
Okay, but what about in the future? Could there ever come a day when there will be a robo-centric perspective as well? I mean, do you foresee any developments that could lead to that, or do you think it's gonna be best to sort of remain with the anthropocentric outlook, or would you ever change your mind and become more of a robocentric, so to speak?
I think the only time that we could maybe really think about looking at it from a robot perspective is if there does come a time where we have robots who are actually conscious, and do deserve to be treated morally well for their own sakes. But I don't think that would mean that I would become more of a robocentrist, because I think regardless of whether these robots become actually conscious or not, this anthropocentric perspective is still really important. We can't lose focus of that, because as I said earlier, it's really important to just make sure that the technology is ultimately beneficial. So I think it would be a case of integrating this robo perspective with my anthropocentric perspective, and not letting go of this anthropocentric perspective, because I do think it's really important.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for that. Thanks for telling us about your paper. Now, before we let you go today, maybe you could also tell us really quickly about the PhD project that you just started up. So you're doing a PhD on something called the ethics of humanoid robots. And so what is this all about?
Right, so I've just started my PhD at Utrecht University, and I'm a part of a project called the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technology. So it's looking at, very similar topics that I even discuss in this paper, looking at, moral agency in relation to humanoid robots, and if they have moral agency, what it would mean for human moral agency. And just grappling with all these topics, the very idea maybe of humanoid robots, if the idea of having these humanoid robots in society is a good idea, is it a bad idea? So I'm really in the beginning stages and kind of grappling with specific topics that I would like to look at. But yeah, I'm very excited. I have a really, really cool supervision team, and I'm very excited to see what the future holds.
Okay, well, I myself am looking forward to seeing what you will come up with. So, Sven Friedman, thank you very much for participating in this podcast discussion.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it a lot.